Welcome to Resilience and Resolve with Lance Drury.
Welcome to Resilience and Resolve with attorney Lance Drury. Lance has spent more than 30 years helping individuals and small business owners resolve serious IRS tax problems. I'm Lisa Mosbey, and today we're talking about what happens after someone provides financial information to the IRS. Many taxpayers assume the IRS simply accepts what they report, but in reality, the agency often verifies that information before making decisions about a case. Welcome back, Lance. Are you ready to dive in?
I'm ready to dive in, Lisa.
Lance, when someone submits financial information to the IRS during a tax resolution case, how closely does the agency review what's provided?
Oh, they do a lot of review because, we talked about this in the last segment. There's such a thing called the national standards. Now, if you don't exceed the national standards, the IRS will accept that, although for some categories you still have to prove it up. But if you exceed the national standards, you're going to have to provide documentation each and every time for that. And their national standards, I think, are arbitrarily low for certain categories. And so, like for housing and utilities, we normally have to submit documentation all the time to prove that up.
And what about meals? I think about meals and entertainment, how that has changed over the years. Is there a national standard for business meals?
Well, there's a national standard for food and clothing and all of that.
Okay.
And the reason is the IRS doesn't want you eating out all the time if you owe them a bunch of money. And so, the only way you can exceed the national standard for food is if you have a special dietary condition and we get a statement from your doctor that you need to have a special diet due to a medical condition that you may have. That reminds me of a case I had several years ago. I had a guy, it took forever to get him an acceptable resolution because he was spending so much money eating out. And it wasn't just him, it was his wife and his kids. And I said, they're not going to take this. He goes, well, I have to do it. The kids are on these sports and we don't have time to cook food at home. We're on the go all the time. So we got to stop at a fast food. Well, it doesn't matter because all those sporting events that his kids are in, they're not really an allowable expense either. The IRS is only going to give you what's a necessary and reasonable expense in determining your ability to pay. I had another case. Woman's taking care of her grandkids. Well, the IRS is not going to say that's an allowable expense unless she had a guardianship on them. Then you have a legal document that requires her, she's obligated to provide for those kids. But short of a legal obligation to do that, the IRS wasn't going to give her those expenses for her grandkids because she wasn't legally liable for their well-being and their welfare.
Let's talk about documentation. I'm curious, what kinds of records or documentation does the IRS typically use to verify income and expense reports, and then like receipts for maybe business meals, or can you just take a per diem?
Well, here's the thing that for the income, it's usually pretty straightforward. If you're a W-2, you just submit pay stubs to the IRS. Then they also can go in and see because any of your income is reported to the IRS. There's a section that we can go into when we prepare returns. It's your wage and income transcripts. And we do that because even if you don't get a 1099, a lot of people draw out of their retirement, they never get it, so they don't put it on the return. Well, they still owe the tax. And so we have to do our due diligence to make sure that when they give us information to prepare a return, that we have all their income, or the IRS is going to tack on a big penalty for understating their income. In terms of expenses, a lot of times we have to go through bank statements, credit card statements, debit card statements to prove all of those categories once. Which leads me to an interesting story. I was on the phone with the IRS once, had a client of mine, and in the middle of giving them his financials, she comes back, she goes, well, we're going to have to turn this over to a revenue officer. And I said, why? She said, because he's got 15 rentals that you didn't tell me about. And so, that's the problem. You've got to list all your assets. And I've had people tell me from time to time, oh, I didn't think I had to list that asset. Well, it's right on the form that says you have to list it. So you can't go about trying to conceal stuff because the IRS is going to find out about it eventually.
And then you mentioned bank statements, going through credit card statements, those kinds of records. Um, is that enough, or do we actually need to keep physical receipts in this day and age?
No, most of the time the IRS will accept bank statements and all that. Now, some people like to pay in cash. So I said, well, we're going to have to delay a resolution because you're going to have to build up 3 or 4 months of cash receipts. If you're going to the gas station and paying for your gas, you got to get a receipt because we have to have proof for the IRS. They're just not going to take our word for it all the time that this expense is what we say it is. Anybody can write down a number. So you've got to have a verification process, and that's normally done through bank statements, credit card statements, and debit card statements.
And when the IRS reviews financial disclosures, what kind of inconsistencies tend to raise red flags?
Well, obviously, if you have an expense, there's a huge number. For example, if you have, let's say you're running a business and you have a huge expense for materials, that's going to automatically run a red flag and you may get audited then, which is a very costly and time consuming process. And then if they start with 1 year, they can open it up to other years and it can take a long time to get it resolved. So you don't want to mess around with the IRS. I mean, I've even had clients admit to me when they got audited, they go, yeah, I really fudged the numbers there. This isn't right. But they knew going in that they were going to get zapped. And so it makes it a lot easier. You don't want to do that. You're messing with the IRS. I have people that give me cash and they think I'm not going to report it. I said, I'm the first guy the IRS would come after. I said, I report every last single cash that I get in this office because I don't want to get in trouble with the IRS. I've seen what that does to people. I've seen what they've done. They can take your assets, they can take your income, they can garnish up to 90% of your take home pay, Lisa. I just had a guy in Tennessee. He owed $1 million. He didn't want to pay the $25,000 retainer. 2 weeks later, they took every asset he owned. He was in his mid 50s. He has no retirement, no assets because he wouldn't hire us to protect his income and his assets. And I don't think that would have happened if he had hired us on that case.
Lance, you've worked with clients who were surprised by how thoroughly the IRS reviews their finances. Can you share a situation where that verification process played an important role in a case?
Well, I don't know if I have any exact war stories like that, but I do know that years and years ago, I had a woman and they were misappropriating the business funds were put into a personal account or whatever, and they really got zapped on the audit. But we saved her because we agreed to accept the audit for 1 year, so it didn't expand to other years. So the liability could have been in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. So by accepting that, using that as a negotiating tool, saying, okay, we're not going to contest this. We're not going to go to US tax court. We're just going to accept it if you agree you're not going to expand the audit to other years. So yeah, that's something. And it really, she really learned a huge lesson for that. And going forward, she became compliant and everything's going great up to this day with her and her firm.
And how does the IRS verify information differently when working through a payment plan compared to evaluating settlement or other resolution options?
Well, a payment plan is a resolution option. If you have a partial pay installment agreement, they're going to ask for all that financial information. Anytime you want to settle with the IRS for less than the full amount, the IRS is going to require thorough financial documentation. Now, if you want to pay it all back, you can set up what's called a streamlined installment agreement. That's normally for 6 years. That's 72 months. So, what they do is just take the amount of your liability, divide it by 72, set you up on a payment plan, and then you don't have to provide all that legal documentation. But if you want a deal It's going to be a lot of work for the taxpayer. It's going to be a lot of work for us. But I tell people in the initial consultation, you have to do what I ask you to do, because if you don't, you're wasting your money. And you wouldn't believe the number of people we have. We've had them for a year. We've had them for a year and a half. Every month we contact them. You got to get your returns prepared, or where the IRS requires the last 6 years tax returns to be prepared and filed, or they're not going to give you a deal. Or we send them a financial statement. We're not going to get anywhere if you don't send me the financial statement. And it's hard to believe, but people just sit on that. But again, maybe it's not so hard to believe. They're procrastinators. That's what got them into this situation to begin with. And even with all the warnings I give them in the initial consultation, this still happens a lot of the time.
What happens if the IRS believes the financial information provided is incomplete or inaccurate?
Well, they just won't accept the numbers. They just won't give you a deal. And sometimes they have access to a lot of financial information, so they're going to know if you're disclosing all of your assets or not. And, if it gets to be too bad, they may send an auditor out for you to get audited. And sometimes that goes criminal. So you don't want to do that. I had a guy years ago. I can't believe he didn't. We're still working on a resolution, but he owed hundreds of thousands of dollars. And he even brought his accountant in to Missouri from Texas. And he had no documentation for all of these business expenses. He owed hundreds of thousands of dollars, and we prevented criminal charges from being instigated against him. How we did that, I don't even know. But, you know, you got to watch it. You just can't give the IRS bogus numbers, or you're going to pay sooner or later.
I'm curious about criminal charges. I'm sure folks sometimes don't intentionally make mistakes. When it comes to assuming that the IRS will check certain details, sometimes it is intentional up on the taxpayer that they're fudging the numbers a little bit. What can land you in jail? What kinds of actions? Is it just non-payment, or are there other behaviors?
Well, I can tell you the most common, and that's not at the IRS level, it's at the state level. And a lot of small business owners do not know this. And I have to tell them this up front. But if you don't pay your sales tax, that's a criminal offense. And we've represented people in state court. I represented a guy that owed $1 million in state sales tax. He had all these restaurants. He would set up a separate LLC and then close it down. And I don't think he realized that even though you have a business, an LLC or a corporation, you're still 100% responsible for the sales tax. And the reason why it's criminal is the state looks at it as a crime because it was never your money. You were just collecting that sales tax for the state. And they take that very, very seriously. And so we've represented a number of people in state courts because of unpaid state sales tax. And I just can't believe that a lot of people don't understand that that's a crime.
Lance, for someone who's preparing to provide financial information to the IRS right now, what should they understand about how closely that information will be reviewed?
Well, you better, like I said at the outset, you better make sure that it's accurate. And we check for that. We go through it 3, 4, 5 times because the taxpayer is submitting those numbers under penalties of perjury. And guess what? You give us bad numbers, we're going to give you bad advice. So, for both of those reasons, we go the extra mile in making sure that the numbers that are submitted to the IRS are accurate.
And how long do we need to keep those tax documents these days?
I think you still have a 7-year requirement on your tax returns. So, you got to keep your returns for at least 7 years.
And what about the substantiating material?
Well, the substantiating material, the IRS always wants current information. So, it doesn't matter what the business did 2 years ago, 3 years ago. When they determine your ability to pay, it's like a snapshot. They want the picture of your financial situation right now. They don't care what you did 2 years ago, and they're not going to assume what your financial situation is going to be 2 years down the road. So it's always current information. And if your financial situation changes, you can always go back to the IRS and get a different agreement with them based upon new financial documentation.
Lance, I think that's where we'll leave it today. Thank you so much for your insights.
Thank you, Lisa. Always a pleasure.
Folks, thank you for listening to Resilience and Resolve with Lance Drury. Providing financial information to the IRS is an important step in resolving tax problems, but it's just as important to understand how that information may be reviewed. If you're dealing with IRS tax issues and want guidance before submitting financial records or disclosures, please visit lancedrurylaw.com. And don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share the show with someone who might need it today. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.